All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Brian Mercer. I'm a planner in the Office of Equitable Development within the Department of Planning and Development Review, and I'm the project manager for the City Center rezoning. And I guess before we get started, I want to let you know that this presentation is available on our website. So if you go, let me pull this up here. If you go to the main PDR webpage, if you go either under plans and city center or useful links under rezonings, they're the same information on each page. And if you zoom down here, you can actually look at the previous presentation from the first public meeting we did on April 13th. And also we have a YouTube video of the recording of it if you want to watch it. But then also the presentation that I'm giving today is available here on the May 11th presentation. So I just wanted to let everybody know that this is available once we are done with the presentation here. So let me share the actual meeting here. All right, can everyone see my screen? All right. Like I said, my name is Brian Mercer. I'm a planner in the Office of Equitable Development, and this is our second public meeting. We had one back in April 13th. So if you're able to attend that one, great. Or if this is your first time, we're happy to have you. Before we get started as well, I wanted to let everyone know kind of where we are in the process. So here are the steps that we've completed so far through this rezoning process. The city center plan was adopted by City Council back in January 24th of this year. And then the big implementation move after that adoption was to rezone City Center. So on March 7th, 2020, I'd like to ask if you're not speaking, can you please mute yourself? Thank you. So we had the resolution of intent to rezone City Center that was approved by Planning Commission on March 7th. Just to get the process started, to do the research and analysis of what we were going to come up with. And the week of March 28th, we did a GIS analysis and we grabbed all the property owners within the study area and we sent them a letter notifying them about these two public meetings and also with my contact information if they had any questions about the rezoning process. And then we had our first public meeting, as I mentioned, on April 13th through Microsoft Teams as well. Then directly after that meeting, we had a survey that was open through SurveyMonkey available to the public from April 13th through the 27th. So we were able to gather those results, and I'll go further into the detail later in this presentation. But we did have that 2-week period of getting the feedback from the public. And then after doing some more research and analysis, we gave a presentation to the staff or the city's planning commission with kind of our draft recommendations, and we got their feedback to hear their thoughts on the rezoning. And then over the past few weeks, we've been developing some more recommendations and using the survey data to kind of create a revised set of recommendations for the rezoning. So here we are tonight for the public meeting number 2 to kind of go over those revised recommendations that we've been working on for the past few weeks. So like I mentioned, if this is your first time from the presentation, I want to give you a little background. So why are we rezoning City Center? So the Richmond 300 update to the master plan was adopted back in December of 2020. And in that plan, it identified City Center as a priority growth node. And there was quite some time where we didn't know if we were going to replace the Coliseum, if we were going to renovate the Coliseum, or we were going to have no Coliseum. But eventually it was determined that no Coliseum was going to be included. So we were tasked with creating a plan that did not involve the Coliseum, and we got feedback from the community to hear what they wanted to see in this area. So that was the creation of the City Center Innovation District Small Area Plan. And as I mentioned, that the first implementation big move from that adopted plan was to rezone City Center to align with the innovation vision by allowing mixed uses, including residential, ground floor activation, and unlimited height and density. So as I'll get into more, the current zoning isn't aligned with the future land use in the area. So we're looking at rezoning it to become in line with the future land use. So I've done this for each of my presentations, but I really just want to begin with the reading out the vision of that city center innovation district plan. So the vision for city center is to become the engine for expanding Greater Richmond's life sciences industries. City center will be the place to live, learn, collaborate, create, and develop new life science businesses in a high density, walkable, urban, full service environment that includes multimodal transportation options to city and regional neighborhoods and job centers. So if you haven't gone through the city center plan, I encourage you to do so. That is also available on our website, which I showed you before. But this is a rendering that is very familiar for those who have read the plan, and kind of showing what our vision is of this area. Along the western portion, you have the hotel and entertainment mixed use to support the convention center. In the yellow here, we have some residential mixed use buildings. But one of the biggest things we heard about during the city center small area plan was we really wanted to see open space and green space where people could gather in this part of town. But then also along the eastern portion, have that life sciences mixed use area as we abut the VCU Health area, but also having a few municipal buildings in the area as well. So this is kind of a representation of our vision for the district. And of course, this is just a rendering. Not every building has to look like this, but this is kind of just what we envision here. So here is a map of the current zoning of the area, and the study area is North 3rd Street to the east, and then south and southwest along 64 and 95, and then to the south along East Broad Street. So this was defined as our study area. And as you can see, a lot of the southwest portion is zoned B4, the Central Business District. But then you also have the CM, which is the Coliseum Mall, the DCC, where the convention center is, the Downtown Civic and Cultural District. You have the RP, which is the Research Park District. And then you also have the RO3, which is your residential office districts. And I provided some more historical background of the zoning in previous presentations, but it really showed how this area used to be multifamily, but then it got rezoned over the years as we brought in the Coliseum and the Research Park. And so really from the 1979 zoning map, this is the same zoning that's been in place since 1979. So it's due for a rezoning. And as I mentioned about the Richmond 300, the future land use plan, this calls for downtown mixed use along the vast majority of the western portion of the study area, which really encourages the mixed use. So you have your residential and your office, commercial, other things of that nature, but a very high density, walkable, pedestrian scaled environment. And going back to the zoning, the CM and the RP districts don't even allow residential at this time. So just changing the zoning to be more in line with the future land use categories of this area was one of our main goals here. And so one of the first things we looked at as we were developing this plan was what uses were permitted in each of the existing zoning districts. And as you can see here up top, here are the main zoning districts that were identified in the existing city center plan, with the exception of the DCC, the convention center. We do not anticipate any changes to that zoning district. So we just included the B4, the CM, the RO3, and the RP. So we looked at the main uses that are either existing or proposed in the city center plan, and looked at, so all these boxes that have the P, and the P in it is the permitted principal use in the district. So if it has the green box, then that means it's allowed by right, as long as you can meet some other feature requirements. But if it's not permitted, then it would require a special use permit. So you can see, as I mentioned, in the CM and the RP districts, it doesn't even allow residential at this time. So we were looking at these uses And as you can see in the RP, it only allows for commercial as an accessory use. So in those large research facilities, you're allowed to have an accessory convenience store or restaurant, but you can't have a standalone restaurant in that zoning district. So this kind of allowed us to see what is there, what's allowed by right, and what would be done through a special use permit from a use standpoint. But then we also looked at the feature requirements of the zoning district. So four of the main features we thought would have an impact on this area are the height limit, the floor area ratio, the fenestration requirement. So that's your doors and windows to allow you to see in and out of the building. But then also your usable open space. That's a relatively new feature requirement that has been added to the zoning ordinance that really encourages usable open space. So it can be balconies, a roof deck, green space, pretty much anything but building area or asphalt for driving. So these are kind of what we're looking at now. The B4, you have no height limit, but there is the 1 and floor inclined plane requirement. It has the FAR of 6.0. It has fenestration requirements and usable open space, but these other districts, as you can see, the CM, it has a height limit of 80 feet, but then there's no other of these feature requirements. The RO3 has the inclined plane and the floor area ratio and fenestration usable open space as well. But then the RP, similar to the CM, it just has the height limit of 120 feet, and then no floor area ratio, fenestration, and usable open space requirement. So when we met back in April, we realized that adding all of these uses to the revised RP district, rather than creating a new zoning district, which the city center plan called for creating an innovation district, we knew we had an existing district there, the RP district, the research park district, where if we just amended that zoning district to add all these uses that were identified before that would really be incorporated into the city center plan, we would think about maybe amending the RP district and potentially expanding it rather than creating a completely new zoning district, because the last zoning district we created was the TOD1 zoning district for the Pulse Corridor plan, but we didn't really have a zoning district in particular that met all the criteria we needed for that. Whereas for the city center plan, we kind of know what uses that we're going to be looking for in the city center plan and some other feature requirements. So that was our reasoning for this change. And then going back to the feature requirements, this is what we proposed and presented in the first public meeting and also to Planning Commission on April 18th. But as in the right column here, our proposal was to have no height limit with no inclined plane, but then potentially have a floor area ratio requirement of 8.0, but then have fenestration requirements and usable open spaces as well. So as I mentioned before, we had that survey that was open to the public from April 13th to the 27th. And overall, we had 57 responses, and it was generally positive feedback. A lot of it was, yes, this zoning is outdated and it's overdue. We need to bring in more mixed use residential buildings. Some of the benefits, like I mentioned, we had several comments in regards to don't limit any height requirements, don't limit any density. This is the part of the city that can handle the most amount of density to create that downtown mixed use future land use category that's talked about. So we heard comments of don't require any inclined plane, don't require any FAR, just let the developers kind of design the building to really increase that density, as I was talking about. And we also heard to really encourage the usable open space requirement and just really allowing by right developments, because as I mentioned, a lot of the CM and the RP do not allow residential now, so that would require a special use permit regardless. And then some of these comments that we heard were not specifically zoning related, but it was kind of incorporated into the city center plan. So they liked that it was pedestrian focused, and just creating one consolidated zoning district throughout the study area rather than these piecemeal different zoning districts. Then some of the concerns we heard were unlimited height. We only had 2 or 3 concerns about unlimited height. Parking, some comments were don't require parking at all, and some comments were make sure there's enough parking for people to get down there. And then affordable housing and transportation infrastructure, again, those are more related to the plan, the city center plan. There are potentially some impacts on zoning, but as some comments we received about adding in bike lanes or transit stops, that's kind of more incorporated in the city center plan. We actually have maps in the city center plan showing those proposed bike lanes and transit infrastructure. But it was just great to hear the responses from the public. Like I said, it was generally positive. It was like, yes, let's get this plan going. It's long overdue. So that was encouraging. So after hearing these responses, after hearing responses from City Planning Commission and other members of the public, we kind of revised. We kept the same proposed use for the uses to allow all those uses in the RP zoning district. But now we're looking at potentially changing the height limit requirement. So instead of, there's still going to be no height limit requirement, but as I'll get into, we're looking at having a building step back requirement instead of the incline plane. But then also instead of having we're not looking at having a floor area ratio requirement, because going back to the city center plan and vision, it talked about unlimited height. But if you have a floor area ratio requirement, that technically limits the height of a building. So we thought that was kind of a good compromise to potentially allow for that additional height, but then have some more form feature requirements that I'll get into. So a building step back is a little different from a lot of times we hear about setbacks from the property lines, but a building step back requirement, it's an architectural design element that typically applies to the upper floors of the building, and it really requires you to kind of push the building in towards the center of the property. And going back to the reasoning for the inclined plane was to maintain that light, air, and pedestrian feel as well. But this is kind of a different approach to maintaining that light with the building step back requirement instead of the inclined plane that's seen in the B4 zoning district. So for our proposed building step back requirement, in the RP Research Park District, there should be no maximum height limit, provided that height above 7 stories requires a minimum building step back of 10 feet from the building facade line along each street frontage. And then such step back shall occur above the ground story and no higher than the 5th story. So what our proposal is that if a building is 7 stories or less, then there's no step back requirement. But if you're looking at a building greater than 7 stories, then we're looking at requiring that 10-foot step back, as I mentioned, but it has to be above the ground floor and it can't be higher than the 5th floor. So you could have your ground floor, then the ceiling, then step back 10 feet, and then unlimited height. You could do it above the 2nd floor, above the 3rd floor, above the 4th floor, above the 5th floor. But then after that, that's where the step back has to be. But then after that step back, there's unlimited height. You can go as high as you want. So that's kind of what we're looking at for the step back requirement rather than an inclined plane. And even depending on certain streets, if you were to apply the inclined plane, this would still meet it. But we just thought allowing that unlimited height and not having that inclined plane that could penetrate into certain buildings would increase density and would allow for as I mentioned, the vision for the unlimited height in the district. So some other additional proposed feature requirements that we're looking at is to increase the fenestration requirement along the ground floor. Right now we have the measurement is taken from 2 feet to 8 feet, and that 60% of that building wall has to have windows or doors for the fenestration. But as part of the Pulse Corridor Plan about increasing that transparency of buildings and the fenestration, we're looking at increasing that calculation area between 3 and 10 feet only along the ground floor. So if you keep it at 60%, but then increase it to 3 to 10 feet, that will increase the fenestration requirement, or increase the fenestration along the ground floor of the buildings, which we want in this part of the city. And we're also looking at not requiring any parking requirement for any use in the proposed RP zoning district. Right now in the B4, there's no, in the TOD1, there's no parking requirements except for dwelling uses, hotels and motels. And in the B4, if you have a mixed use building where you have ground floor commercial, there's no parking requirement for the residential units. So you could have ground floor commercial and 300 dwelling units, but there would technically be no parking requirement. So we just thought that not requiring any parking requirements on our end, we imagine if a hotel comes in, they're not going to come in and not provide any parking, but we're going to allow them to determine how many parking spaces they needed. And right now in the B4, it's one parking for a hotel, it's one parking space per 4 guest rooms. So more than likely there's more. So our, even now, like our requirement for a hotel in the B4 is not really that high. So our proposal is to not require any parking and then just let the developers determine what their parking count is, kind of similar to what we have going on over the Diamond District, where it's technically in the TOD1 and no parking's required for office, retail, commercial, but they're still going to be providing, they have their own ratios where they're going to determine based on the area. And then another kind of new feature requirement we're looking at is called a blank wall requirement along the ground floor. Some buildings you'll see downtown, they have these large blank walls across the building, and it really doesn't create a great pedestrian feel when you're walking there to have this blank wall along the entire street frontage. So what we're looking at doing for these new buildings, so this, if a building's already there, this feature would become non-conforming and it wouldn't impact it. But for new buildings, we would have the horizontal linear dimension can't exceed 20 feet where there's not a door or a window for that fenestration. So that's something we think applying that will prevent you from seeing those large blank walls that you see downtown. And some other feature requirements, the front yard setback, kind of similar to the B4 now. We have no front yard setback, but we have a 10-foot maximum. So that's really about keeping those buildings close to the street to enhance the pedestrian feel in the area. But then have no street side yard setback requirement. So you have your front yard along the street, but then there's no requirement along the street side yard if it's a corner lot. If it's not a corner lot, then this doesn't apply. And then I briefly mentioned this at the Planning Commission meeting, but it wasn't fully available for the last public meeting. So another feature in the zoning ordinance and on the zoning map we have now is what we call street-oriented commercial frontages. And these are designated on the zoning map. And as you can see here, this is taken from the city center plan, and this is East Clay Street. Hopefully when we bring it back up to grade, this is kind of like our festival streetscape. So we really want to have that street-oriented frontage along the entire street here to create that. And then you have the large outdoor green space area for a public gathering. But for these street-oriented commercial frontages, if it's a multifamily building along the street frontage, it requires that you have another permitted principal use in the zoning district. So we wouldn't want to have ground floor residential units where a lot of times people have their blinds closed or windows dark. We really want to have that ground floor activation. So that's where, when it's designated these street frontages, it would require that activation by not allowing the residential units along the floor. So then in addition to street-oriented commercial, we have a different designation called priority street frontage, where that doesn't have the other permitted principal use requirement, but it prevents access points for parking decks. And if there is a parking deck along that street frontage, it requires another permitted principal use. So again, going to downtown, you see a lot of street frontage where the entire frontage is just a parking deck. So when we identify these priority streets, we say any new construction that we would require a different permitted use along that priority street. So you just don't have a blank wall of a parking deck there. And then also it has some requirements in regards to hotels, and then fenestration requirements as well. So here is what, going back to the existing zoning, before I go into our proposal, as I mentioned, here's the RO3, the RP, the CM. So these do not allow for residential now, but the future land use calls for the downtown mixed use. So with those RP amendments that I described, we're looking at expanding that RP zoning district throughout the entire planning area, except for the downtown or the convention center, to keep that the downtown civic and cultural zoning district. And also there's a little portion here along North 3rd Street that it was RO3, but we thought it would be good to, we looked at those uses and they're small office uses, and I think a 3-unit building there, but we thought that just keeping that as RO3, that may be a good buffer in between the 2nd Street and the Jackson Ward area. So with that expanded RP district, bringing in the street-oriented commercial and the priority street frontages that I just mentioned, along the southwest here, outside the study area and partly inside the study area, you'll see that we have some existing ones. So these dotted lines along Broad Street and Gray Street, those are existing. And actually you have some in the study area along North 6th Street and along East Marshall. We have some that are those are existing street-oriented commercial, and then these lighter yellow lines, those are existing priority street frontages. But within the study area, these yellow lines are streets along North 7th, North 9th, North 11th, going north to south, and then East Marshall, East Clay, and East Jackson Street. Those are all proposed as priority street frontages. So again, those are not allowing parking decks or entrances along the street frontage of those areas, and fenestration requirements as well. But then also looking at creating that street-oriented commercial frontage. So that's not allowing the residential units on the ground floor all along Clay Street. So again, hopefully opening up Clay Street, bringing it to grade, and then keeping it at grade all the way to North 5th Street to create that festival streetscape that is mentioned in the city center plan. So these are the proposed street frontages for the city center area. And we're also looking at extending the priority street frontages and the street oriented commercial requirements along Broad Street, because right now it stops at North 9th Street, but just to continue that along down to Broad Street towards the interstate. So our next steps, we're going to gather any comments, whether it's tonight or over the next few days, but I'm going to give
the war in Ukraine, the fallout from the pandemic, all playing key roles.
Brian, you're muted.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know what happened there. I think someone probably did a mute all. Anyways, so we're going to give a very similar presentation as I gave tonight at the City Planning Commission meeting, and then gather some feedback, and then eventually work on the O&R request that will eventually go back to City Planning Commission for final approval, and then eventually go to City Council, hopefully for final approval. And our goal is to have it approved at the July 25th City Council meeting. And then, as I mentioned, this is the link that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation that takes you to all the past presentations, at the public meeting, and also it has the presentation of the resolution of intent and the ones at City Planning Commission. But also we'll just be we'll be updating the information from the last public meeting that is currently on the website with the new revised recommendations that I presented tonight on the website as well. So if there's any questions that come up, you can either look at that website, and then also you can contact me directly, whether through email or phone call. I'm more than willing to talk with you or just to hear what you have to say, because it's really just encouraging to hear from the public what they have to say about this process. So that's all I had for tonight. At this time, I wanted to leave some time for any questions or comments. If I went too quickly through something, or if you wanted to go back and revisit a slide, I'd be more than happy to as well. But that is what I have. I guess if you have any questions, you can raise your hand, and through Microsoft Teams, I can call on you. Or again, if you don't feel comfortable in this setting about giving your thoughts, I'm more than willing to talk or email you with you about this proposal as well. So this is not a last call by any means. This is just we'd like to hear your thoughts. We didn't have anyone speak at the last meeting either, so I don't feel bad if that's the case again. If you're somebody who participated in the survey, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to do that. It was really, like I mentioned several times, it was very encouraging to just hear the support we had for this project. Again, you're not going to get 100% agreement on everything, but just seeing that overwhelming support for this rezoning was encouraging. So I thank you for that. And if you all right, well, I don't want to keep anyone too long if there's no questions. Again, let me share my, just in case you weren't able to get it down here. This is my contact information here. If you need it, I'm more than willing to talk, or if you like email, that's fine with me as well. But if there's no other questions at this time, thank you all for attending today. If you would like to hear this presentation again or see any changes we might make over the next few days, the Planning Commission meeting is Monday at 1:30. It's available in person on the 5th floor of the conference room of City Hall, 900 East Broad Street. So you can either come and see the presentation in person, or they also have the option through Microsoft Teams as well. And that access information is available on Legistar. So if you want to hear that presentation again, and again, that's just a presentation on what what I presented today on our recommendations. It's not the final approval for a city planning commission. There's going to be another public hearing for that. So this is just the update from the last draft presentation we gave. So I don't want you thinking that this is going to be approved on Monday. This is strictly just a presentation to kind of hear what their comments are, because I gave and then the draft. So now this is the revised one, and there's probably going to be one, if not more, presentations. So if you are interested in attending that meeting on Monday, we'd be happy to have you. But again, if there's no questions tonight in this meeting, thank you all for coming. And if you don't feel comfortable talking today in this meeting, then please email me or call me. All right, everyone have a good night.
Thank you.